In 1933, a French Foreign Legion patrol crossed a stretch of the Algerian Sahara that no map had ever properly recorded. They were chasing rumours of a lost outpost, and what they found instead was a wall. Not a hill, not a dune, not a rock formation. A wall. Cut stone, dressed and squared, running in a straight line for over 300 metres before it disappeared back under the sand. The officer in charge wrote in his report that the masonry was, and these are his words, of a quality I have only seen in the great cathedrals of Europe. He sketched the joints, he measured the blocks, and then he was reassigned. The report was filed in Paris, marked for further study, and never opened again. Today, that wall is somewhere under 20 feet of new sand, in a country that has more pressing concerns than walking out into the desert to find walls that aren't supposed to exist. But the sketch survives, the measurements survive, and they don't match anything the official history of North Africa says was there. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on the planet, 3.5 million square miles of nothing, or so we are told. Because if you start pulling on threads, looking at satellite imagery, reading the survey reports that nobody bothers to read anymore, listening to what Bedouin tribes have been saying for centuries while everyone else ignored them, you start to notice something strange. The Sahara is full of structures, roads, foundations, aqueducts that lead to nowhere, cities that shouldn't be there, geometry that lines up with sites in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in places thousands of miles apart. And the dating, when anyone actually does the dating, keeps coming back wrong. Older than the pyramids, older than civilization itself according to the textbooks. So either the textbooks are wrong, or somebody at some point built something enormous in a place where supposedly nothing was ever built. This is the story of what is buried under the sand, the grid, the cities, the infrastructure, and the very strange historical pattern that suggests the entire region was, at one time, connected to a global network of trade, technology, and shared architecture that the modern world has decided to forget. Before we go further, hit subscribe. The kind of research that goes into these videos takes weeks, and the only reason this channel can keep pulling on these threads is because people like you stick around for the full picture. So subscribe, turn the bell on, and let's keep going. To understand why the Sahara story is so unsettling, you have to first understand what the official history says. The mainstream timeline is simple. The Sahara was once a green, wet savanna. About 6,000 years ago, the climate shifted, the rain stopped, the land dried out. The people who lived there packed up and moved, mostly to the Nile Valley, where they founded what we now call ancient Egypt. The Sahara, after that, became a barrier, a wasteland, something you crossed if you absolutely had to, on the back of a camel hoping to come out the other side alive. Trade routes existed, sure, but the desert itself was empty. No civilizations, no cities, just sand, scorpions, and the occasional Tuareg caravan. That is the story you were taught in school. That is the story repeated in every documentary, every textbook, every National Geographic special. And the problem is, it doesn't match the evidence. Start with the satellites. In the early 2000s, NASA began publishing high-resolution imagery of the Sahara, and almost immediately, archaeologists started spotting things they couldn't explain. Long straight lines crossing hundreds of miles of empty desert, geometric shapes embedded in the terrain, patterns that, from the ground, were invisible, but from orbit were unmistakable. One of the most famous examples is in southern Libya, in a region called the Messac Setafet. There, satellite imagery revealed what looked like a massive grid of underground channels stretching for thousands of square miles, all of them feeding into a series of central hubs. The official explanation called them ancient riverbeds, dried out remnants of when the Sahara was wet. But here is the issue. Riverbeds don't form right angles. Riverbeds don't intersect at perfect 90-degree intersections. Riverbeds don't run in parallel lines spaced evenly apart mile after mile, as if they were laid out on a drafting table. Whatever those channels are, they are not natural. and the local Tuareg, when asked, simply shrugged and said what they have always said. The old people built them before the sand came. The old people. That phrase shows up over and over again in Saharan oral tradition. The Tuareg, the Tubu, the various Berber groups all have legends about a civilization that came before. A people who built in stone, who irrigated the desert, who had cities of light and metal. The legends describe these ancestors as tall, fair-haired, with knowledge of writing, mathematics and metallurgy that the desert tribes themselves no longer possessed. Western anthropologists for over a century dismissed these stories as garbled folklore, but the satellites kept showing things. And then the dating started coming back. In 2007, a team of geologists working in Algeria sampled a structure that had been catalogued, with no further explanation, as a rock formation. The structure was rectangular, 60 feet long, 20 feet wide, made of basalt blocks that fit together with no visible mortar. The team, doing a routine survey, decided to test the carbon content of organic material trapped between the blocks. The result came back at 12,000 years before present. 12,000. That is older than every recognized civilization. Older than Sumer, older than Egypt, older than Çatalhöyük. The team published a brief paper, the paper was challenged, the dating was disputed, and the structure was quietly removed from the active research list. Today you can find references to it in old French colonial archaeology journals, but if you try to look it up in any current academic database, it has been scrubbed. This is a pattern, and once you start noticing it, you can't stop. In Mauritania there is a place called the Riche structure, also known as the Eye of the Sahara. It is a circular geological formation, almost 30 miles wide, made up of 3 concentric rings. From orbit it looks like a target, or depending on who you ask, like a city plan. The official explanation is that the Riche is a deeply eroded geological dome formed by volcanic activity hundreds of millions of years ago. And it might be. But there is also a growing body of researchers, some of them with respectable academic credentials, who have pointed out that the Riche matches, with eerie precision, Plato's description of Atlantis. 3 concentric rings located on the western edge of an ancient continent, surrounded by mountains, connected to the sea by a system of canals that, on satellite imagery, are clearly visible as dry channels leading toward the Atlantic. The Riche sits at the elevation Plato described. It has the dimensions Plato described, and the geology around it shows clear evidence of catastrophic flooding, a sudden inundation followed by rapid drying, exactly the kind of event that would erase a city built on the lower rings while leaving the higher geological structure intact. Mainstream archaeology refuses to engage with this comparison. The standard response is that Atlantis is a myth, and that comparing a geological feature to a myth is not science, which is fair, except that the Riche is not the only Saharan site that lines up with descriptions in ancient texts, and the pattern of those alignments is hard to dismiss as coincidence. Take the Garamantes. The Garamantes were a civilization that lived in what is now southwestern Libya, at a place called Germa. The Greeks knew about them, Herodotus mentions them, the Romans tried to conquer them and mostly failed. According to the official record, the Garamantes were a small kingdom that flourished from around 500 BC to about 700 AD, surviving in the desert by digging an extensive system of underground tunnels called fogaras, which tapped into ancient aquifers and brought water to their cities. Standard story. Iron Age desert civilization, rises, falls, gets absorbed by Islamic expansion. The end. But satellite imagery has now revealed that the Garamantes did not have a small kingdom. They had an empire. Their Foggara system, which mainstream archaeology dated to about 2,000 years ago, extends for over 2,000 miles, with documented branches connecting sites that are nowhere near any known Garamantes city. Some of the Fogaras run under areas that have been completely buried by sand for thousands of years, meaning they were dug before the desertification, meaning they predate the Garamantes themselves by a wide margin. The civilization that the Romans called the Garamanti was in all likelihood a late-stage remnant of something much older and much larger. Something that had a continental water management system, something that ran a grid, and that word, grid, is the one that keeps coming back. In 2011, a satellite survey of the Central Sahara identified over 1,000 previously unknown archaeological sites. 1,000. In a single survey. The sites included walled compounds, pyramidal structures, road networks, and what appear to be observatory platforms aligned to specific astronomical events. The lead researcher called the discovery a lost civilization that should rewrite the history of North Africa. His paper got significant attention in archaeological circles, and then, predictably, funding for follow-up surveys dried up. Most of the sites have never been physically visited. They sit in the imagery, catalogued and forgotten, while the same researchers go back to defending the same old timeline. So what do we have? We have walls in Algeria that look medieval but date to the Ice Age. We have channels in Libya that ignore the laws of natural geomorphology. We have the Riche structure that lines up with Plato. We have the Garamantes impossible water grid. We have 1,000 undocumented sites that nobody can be bothered to study. And we have oral traditions going back as far as oral traditions go, describing a great prior civilization that built in stone and disappeared under the sand. Now connect this to what some researchers call the Tartareya framework. The framework, in short, argues that prior to the 1800s there existed a global civilization with shared architecture, shared technology, and shared infrastructure that was systematically erased and replaced by the modern nation-state model that we live under today. The evidence for the framework is contested, but the pattern it describes, when you apply it to the Sahara, fits with uncomfortable precision. The Sahara, according to the framework, was not a barrier. It was a corridor, a network of cities connected by aqueducts and roads linking the Atlantic coast of Africa to the Nile, to the Levant, to the Mediterranean, and from there to the rest of the Old World. When the network collapsed, the desert took it. The sand came in, the buildings fell, the survivors scattered, and within a few generations the entire memory of what had been there was reduced to half-remembered legends and Roman travel writers wondering why these desert tribes spoke of cities that were not there. What was the network actually moving? That is where it gets interesting. Because the Sahara, in the standard story, was not a place where you would build trade infrastructure. There is nothing there. No water, no metals, no agriculture, no population worth trading with. Why would anyone build a continent-spanning road and water system across a wasteland? The answer, of course, is that it was not a wasteland when it was built, and what it was moving was not what you might assume. Salt, gold, copper. These were the obvious commodities of the trans-Saharan trade in the medieval period, the period that history actually remembers. But before that, going back into the deep past, the Sahara was apparently moving something else. Tin, specifically, a kind of tin with an isotopic signature that matches deposits in Central Africa, in places that, according to the official story, no ancient civilization could ever have reached. The bronze that built the ancient world, the bronze that armoured Greek hoplites and shaped the swords of Mesopotamian kings, contained tin that came from inside the Sahara, or, more precisely, came from underneath what is now the Sahara. Through a transportation network that we have no record of, run by a civilization we are not allowed to discuss. The economic implications of this are enormous. If the Sahara was a functioning trade corridor with cities, water management and continental-scale infrastructure, then the entire economic model of the ancient world has to be rewritten. The Mediterranean was not the centre of civilization. The Mediterranean was an outpost on the northern edge of a much larger Saharan economic zone. Egypt was not the source of civilization. Egypt was a riverside trading port for a civilization that was based in the interior. And the so-called Dark Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC was not a generalized regional downturn. It was the collapse of the Saharan network, the moment when the climate shift or the war or whatever it was finally took out the trunk lines and the peripheral civilizations like Egypt and Mycenae and the Hittites suddenly lost their supply chains and went into freefall. This reframing changes everything. It means that the cities we admire as the cradles of civilization were actually downstream beneficiaries of a much larger system, and that when the larger system died, the cities went with it. It means that the historical record we have is not the record of how civilization started. It is the record of what survived after civilization mostly ended. And once you see it that way, a lot of strange things start making sense. Take the Egyptian construction methods. Egyptian engineers in the official timeline just sort of figured out how to cut and move multi-ton granite blocks, develop complex astronomical alignments, and build pyramids in the middle of the desert, all within a few hundred years of supposedly inventing agriculture. This has always been a problem. The standard explanation is that they were just very clever, that they had a lot of time, that they had a lot of slaves, and that the achievement, while impressive, is fully explainable within the conventional framework. Maybe. But if you accept that the Egyptians inherited their techniques from a prior civilization that had been doing this for millennia, the development curve makes a lot more sense. They did not invent the pyramid. They received the pyramid. The same pattern applies to Mesopotamia. Sumerian mathematics, Sumerian astronomy, Sumerian writing, all of it appears in the archaeological record as a fully developed system. There is no precursor. There is no slow refinement. One day in the conventional timeline there is no writing. The next day there is cuneiform, and the people using it are doing trigonometry. Mainstream historians shrug at this and call it the Neolithic Revolution, as if the word revolution explains it. But a revolution that produces simultaneously agriculture, urbanism, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, religion and law in 3 different river valleys separated by thousands of miles, all within a few centuries of each other, is not a revolution. It is a redistribution. The technology came from somewhere. The somewhere is what we are not supposed to ask about. The Sahara in this model is the somewhere. Now let's look at the strangest piece of physical evidence, which is the so-called Saharan glass. In the western desert of Egypt, in a region called the Great Sand Sea, there are deposits of yellowish-green glass scattered across hundreds of square miles. The glass is almost pure silica, with trace inclusions of iridium and other elements that suggest it was formed under extraordinarily high temperatures, on the order of 2000 degrees Celsius or higher. The mainstream explanation is that the glass was formed by a meteor airburst somewhere around 26 million years ago. This is plausible, but there is a problem with the dating. The same glass, in the same chemical composition, appears in artifacts dated to the Egyptian dynastic period. The famous pectoral of Tutankhamun contains a piece of Saharan glass cut and polished into a scarab. If the glass is 26 million years old, and Tutankhamun's craftsmen were just picking it up off the ground, that explains it. But there is a competing theory advanced by a small number of researchers that the glass deposits are not all that old, that some of them, the densest concentrations, are recent. Recent meaning within the last 12,000 years. And recent in this case means that something happened very recently in geological terms that produced surface temperatures sufficient to melt sand into glass over an area the size of a small country. Whatever happened in the Western Desert, it was not slow erosion. It was an event, a fast, hot, extremely violent event, and it happened at exactly the time the Sahara was supposedly transitioning from green savanna to dry desert. Was it a meteor? Maybe. Was it something else? The researchers asking that question tend to lose their funding. But the question hangs there, unresolved, in the geological record. There is a parallel story which involves the so-called silica caps that show up across northern Africa, the Levant and into Central Asia. These are layers of fused, vitrified rock that appear at the same approximate stratigraphic depth across thousands of miles. Mainstream geology calls them weathering products. A small minority of researchers note that weathering products do not produce vitrified, glass-like surfaces, and that the silica caps look for all the world like the residue of an immense thermal event. The researchers asking what could produce a thermal event of that scale across that distance at that time are not invited to many conferences. But the silica caps are still there. You can still see them, so we have an extinct civilization with a continental water network. We have evidence of a sudden catastrophic event that left a glass field in Egypt and silica caps from Morocco to Mongolia. We have oral traditions describing a prior people who built in stone. We have inherited technologies in Egypt and Mesopotamia that show up fully formed without precursors. And we have, on satellite imagery, the outlines of 1,000+ undocumented sites in the central Sahara that nobody is allowed to study. What does this add up to? It adds up to a hypothesis that the Sahara was the heartland of an old world civilization, connected by a grid of roads and aqueducts, that something catastrophic happened to that civilization, and that the cultures we know from the historical record, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, are the survivors. The diaspora, the cultural fragments that washed up on the edges of the dead zone and rebuilt as best they could, with the techniques and the stories they had inherited from the old world. And that the modern academic refusal to engage with this hypothesis is not because the evidence is weak, but because the implications are too disruptive. Because if the Sahara was a civilization, then the entire timeline of human history is wrong, and a lot of careers and a lot of institutional reputations are built on that timeline being right. There is one more piece, and this is the piece that, for many researchers, is the most damning. Across the Saharan archaeological record, there is a strange and consistent gap, a discontinuity. The earlier sites, the ones dated to before about 10,000 years ago, show evidence of monumental construction, advanced metallurgy, and complex astronomical knowledge. The later sites, the ones from the dynastic period of Egypt onward, show those same techniques, but in a degraded form, as if the practitioners had forgotten some crucial pieces, as if they were copying something they no longer fully understood. The rock-cut tombs in places like Giza and Saqqara are precise to fractions of a millimetre, with internal angles and surface finishes that modern engineers struggle to reproduce. The contemporary tombs built by the same dynasties are sloppier, cruder. The surfaces are uneven, the angles are off, the finish is rough. The official explanation is that the precise tombs were built for the most important pharaohs, and the rougher ones for lesser figures. But the dating does not actually support this. The most precise structures are, consistently, the oldest. The newer structures, even when built for major rulers, are visibly inferior. This is the signature of decline. Not progress, decline. Each generation knew slightly less than the last. The techniques were being lost. And by the time the new kingdom rolls around, the Egyptians are building with mud brick and painted plaster, because the old methods are gone. The old masters are gone. The old quarries have been exhausted or forgotten. And the civilization is operating on the cultural memory of something that used to be much greater. This is what happens when a civilization receives a tradition rather than building one. The peak is at the beginning, everything after is degradation, and the Sahara, if it was the source civilization, would have been the peak. Everything we admire in the ancient Mediterranean is a downstream copy. Some of you are going to push back on this, and you should. The orthodox timeline is the orthodox timeline because on most points it is well supported. Carbon dating works, stratigraphy works. The basic outline of when humans developed agriculture and built cities is not in serious dispute, but the orthodoxy has blind spots, and the Sahara is one of the biggest. The blind spot exists not because the evidence is weak, but because the evidence is logistically inaccessible. The Sahara is enormous, it is hot, it is politically unstable. The kind of long-term, well-funded archaeological work that has illuminated Egypt, Greece and Mesopotamia has never been possible in the Central Desert. The sites that we know about almost by accident. A satellite caught an outline, a drilling crew hit a wall, a French officer in 1933 wrote a report that nobody read. The default assumption in the absence of evidence has been that there is nothing there. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when there are millions of square miles of sand that nobody has ever surveyed. The Sahara is the largest unstudied archaeological zone on the planet, and every time anyone actually studies a piece of it, the dates come back wrong. The structures look too sophisticated. The pattern is too consistent. There is a deeper question hidden in all of this, which is the question of why. Why was this story buried? Why is the orthodox timeline so resistant to revision? Some of the answer is institutional. Academic careers are built on consensus, and consensus once established is hard to dislodge. Some of the answer is funding. The institutions that fund archaeological research are not interested in conclusions that overturn the framework they have spent a century building. And some of the answer, the part that sits in the more speculative territory, is that there are interests, governmental, religious, financial, that benefit from the existing story being the only story. The history of civilization, as we are taught it, supports a particular view of human progress, linear, always upward, always improving. A history that includes a lost, more advanced predecessor disrupts that narrative. That is not a story that is helpful to the institutions that profit from the assumption of continuous progress. So the Sahara stays buried, the sites stay unsurveyed, the reports stay in the archives. The Tuareg keep telling their stories about the old people, and the rest of the world keeps not listening. And every year, a few new pieces of evidence bubble up, get a brief flurry of attention, and then sink back into the obscurity from which they came. But the evidence accumulates, the satellites keep watching, the amateur researchers, the independent scholars, the writers and podcasters who do not depend on academic funding to ask awkward questions, they keep pulling on the threads. And slowly, very slowly, the picture is changing. There is more open discussion now of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, of the possibility of a major catastrophe around 12,000 years ago, of pre-dynastic Egyptian civilization, of pre-Sumerian urbanism in places like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, where stone temples were built around the same time the Sahara was supposedly drying out. The story is shifting, not in the textbooks, not yet, but in the surrounding conversation. And the Sahara is at the center of all of it, because if any single region holds the evidence that would settle the question, it is the Sahara. The walls are still there, the cities are still there, the grid is still there, buried under the sand, waiting for someone to come and dig it up, or waiting as the wind shifts and the dunes move to dig itself up. Sahara dunes are not static. They migrate, they reveal. Every year things appear that were not visible the year before, and every year people are out there, mostly Bedouin, occasionally academic, looking at what the desert has decided to show. What gets shown next is anyone's guess. But the pattern of the last 50 years suggests that the discoveries will keep coming, that they will keep being uncomfortable, and that the official story will keep having to make room. Whether the official story can stretch enough to accommodate a continental pre-dynastic civilization with a working water grid is another question. So far, the answer has been no. Somewhere out there, under a few feet of sand, there is a wall that a French officer measured in 1933 and called the equal of a European cathedral. There is a city, or the ruins of a city, that nobody has visited in 9,000 years. There is a foggerer that runs from a mountain to a vanished sea, carrying water that nobody is alive to drink. There is, possibly, the answer to questions that the orthodox history has decided are not worth asking. The Sahara holds it. The sand has held it for a long time. And one day, possibly soon, possibly not for centuries, the sand is going to give it up. When that happens, the story we have all been told will need to be rewritten. The cradle of civilization will have to be moved. The achievements of the ancient world will have to be reattributed, at least in part, to a predecessor that we have no name for. The timeline will have to expand. The map will have to be redrawn. The desert is patient, the sand is patient, but the truth eventually comes out. And when it does, it is not going to be in a press release. It is going to be in a satellite image or a sand clearing operation, or a sample sent to a lab that this time does not get suppressed. It is going to be a single piece of evidence finally that cannot be explained away, and then the pieces that have been quietly piling up for 100 years will all suddenly fit. The Sahara was part of the old world grid. The structures are still there. They have been there the whole time. The question is not whether they exist. The question is when we, collectively, are going to stop pretending they don't. That is the story. That is what is buried under the sand, and that is what they did not want you to know.